130,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. We started filling those tanks about 7 hours ahead of time. We ignite our liquid engines about 6.5 seconds ahead. They come up to full power, the boosters then ignite. Cleared the tower in just a few seconds. And then we go into a roll maneuver to make sure that we're pointed at the right position. Here you see the roll maneuver to make sure that we go to the right point in space. The engines and the boosters, they both have steering capabilities. So you see the moon there. That was really an incredible sight to walk out and realize that the moon's sitting right there as we're about to launch. 2 minutes into flight, the solid rocket boosters have done their job. We separate them. There are booster separation motors to push them away to make sure we don't recontact the stage and the rest of the rocket used to accelerate towards space. We have service modules up above the top of the rocket. We're above a lot of the atmospheric pressure, so we jettison those. Our launch abort system, I'll talk about later, but that's what I call the utmost state. Once we get to a certain point, safe. Our upper stage, which gives us the final push to go after the moon, separates later on into the flight. Then you see the upper stage following away as the rocket continues onto the moon. That was Artemis 1 the launch of Artemis 1 in just about a minute and a half. The Artemis generation truly has begun. It's a new era of people, of team members. It's the next generation, but it's also a new era of spacecraft, of rockets, and it's one we're incredibly excited to be a part of. With the Artemis generation, we're going to explore the moon and go out to Mars like we've only dreamed of for so many years. And Artemis 1 was a critical first step to that. We are going back to the moon. We're going to the moon to learn how to live and work on other planetary bodies. The International Space Station and the Space Shuttle did an incredible job of teaching us how to live in microgravity for long durations of time. The moon is going to help us learn how to live and work on other rocky bodies where the environment's different and the challenges are different. So we are going back to the moon. Apollo changed the world. I'm a huge NASA space nerd, and I absolutely love the Apollo generation and that Saturn V rocket. It is on their shoulders of those giants that we stand on today to go back with the Artemis, but this time we're going back different, because this time we're going back to stay. We're going to land the first woman, the first person of color, and a whole bunch of other astronauts on the moon to help us explore and to help us prepare for the next giant leap, that is Mars. Artemis, the twin sister of Apollo, the goddess of the moon. It was truly fitting that it was her name that we picked for our return. When we look at Artemis, we have this swoosh chart, and I call it the swoosh chart because I love saying the word swoosh. It's fun. I break it down into two different portions. You've got the swoosh part. That's the last time I promise, swoosh. And then you've got your surface operations. Artemis 1, an uncrewed test flight. We just flew that November 16th through December 11th. Uncrewed, make sure that with the spacecraft is safe, and we'll go into that later. Artemis 2, we're going to be putting 4 astronauts on board for a lunar flyby mission. 3 Americans and 1 Canadian will make that trip. They will be the first astronauts to look out the window and see the moon soar past beneath them or above them, whatever the orientation may be. We're going to be building up what we call the Gateway. It's our lunar orbital outpost, where we'll be able to send Orion to and dock with it, various landers. Terrific international component, working with our partners from all around the world to make Gateway happen. Beginning with Artemis 3, we'll begin our surface operations. We will put boots back on the surface of the moon. And as we go, our missions will progressively get more complex as we learn what is required to live on the moon and to do the missions that we need them to do. Now, at the same time, we're also sending robotic missions. We have what we call the Commercial Lunar Payload Services missions. The first one of these is going to be launching later this year on a ULA Vulcan rocket. We've learned a lot from studying robotics, from using robotics on other planets and having them in orbit and around other worlds and other moons. Spirit, Opportunity, I'm an old school Mars guy, so Spirit and Opportunity come to mind first, but what we're learning with Curiosity and Perseverance as they're exploring Mars, I think is really opening our eyes to just how much we can learn from these robotic explorers. And I envision that when we get down the road that we'll be using those robotic explorers as scouts to check out outcrops while we're on the moon, much like Perseverance uses its Ingenuity helicopter to scout out different areas. So with Artemis, when we move as we're moving forward, it's not robots or humans, it is robots and humans. And I think that's an incredibly exciting thing. Now, I do come from a geology background, which means I love rocks. I love rocks a lot. And from a geologic perspective, the moon is an incredibly fascinating world to go explore. You guys probably know, but during there's a period of time in solar system formation called the Late Heavy Bombardment, some 3.5 billion years ago. Tons of extra stuff flying around through the atmosphere, smacking into the planets. Well, Earth, we have plate tectonics and we have weathering, so we erase a lot of those signatures. We erase a lot of those scars. The moon, for all intents and purposes, never really had a substantial atmosphere. And in fact, really about the only thing that erases craters on Mars are other craters or the lava flow caused by those other impacts. So the moon is a terrific archive of what the early solar system was like and how rocky bodies formed. So by studying the moon and by going there and exploring it, we're not only learning how to live and work on other worlds, we're also learning how the early solar system formed and how it evolved and how rocky bodies change and evolve. So incredibly fascinating, both from a technological standpoint, but also from a geologic standpoint. We are going to the lunar South Pole. Most of the Apollo missions, were mainly equatorial. We are going to lunar South Pole for a number of reasons. Primarily among them is the presence of water ice. In order to live and work off the Earth for sustained periods of time, we have to be able to use the resources that are present where we're going. Much like when the early explorers would sail to the New World, they had to learn what was there and how can they best use it. We have a lot of data that indicates there's a significant amount of water ice, and most of this is down in the South Pole in what we call permanently shadowed regions. There are shadowed regions on the moon, especially down in these craters, that have not seen sunlight in 4 billion years. Some of the coldest places in the solar system are not out at Jupiter and Neptune. They're in our own backyard in these shadowed regions on the moon. And we'll use that water to support the astronauts. Of course, they like to drink water and they like to stay clean, and it's important that we give them both. If not, they get really mad when you don't give them enough water. But we do want to take care of our astronauts. But we can also use water, break it up into hydrogen and oxygen, and use as propellant. Well, we can recombine that in a combustion environment, and we have rocket fuel, and we produce thrust. So anything that we don't have to take with us is a significant mass savings that we can devote to other things that we really do need to take. We did outline, you can see here on the slide, 13 different landing regions. These were outlined last summer. Each one of these landing regions has multiple landing sites inside of them, and teams are looking at which of these are the most viable and where ultimately we'll make that landing. So while we're looking at the moon, when we look at human space exploration, we've got 3 main areas that we're really looking at right now. We have low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station orbits some 250 miles up, traveling 17,500 miles an hour. That's 5 miles a second. When we launch crews there, we can get them there in about 3 hours, get them back fairly quickly as well. Regularly send supplies there. We've got great communication with them. Terrific environment. When we look at the moon, 250,000 miles away, 1,000 times further than the International Space Station. Depending on how you go, 3 days to get there, 3 days to get back, generally speaking. Coming back in from the atmosphere, we're upwards of 25,000 miles an hour. We're still relatively close, so we've got great communication with them for most of the part. When we're on the other side of the moon, it's a little bit more challenging or even impossible, but for the most part, great communication with the moon. We've got an opportunity to really test that environment, to test things, and but be far enough away that you can start to simulate some of those long distance durations where you can't rely on the Earth as much. But when we look at Mars, we're talking a completely different ballgame. 40 million miles away, 9 months to get there, 9 months to get back with current chemical propulsion. If something happens when we're on our way to Mars, we're not hitting the next U-turn and coming home. So we have to make sure that our spacecraft, that our astronauts, that our software, and that our procedures are as robust as they possibly can be. Because once we commit to Mars, it is a long, dangerous journey. And that brings us back to the moon, our test bed, where we can test these technologies in a low-G environment where we have to have our astronauts picking up samples, handling jagged rocks, and developing the technologies that we're going to need to learn that we're going to need to live off of the land. Because Mars indeed is the horizon goal. And once we go to Mars, we'll continue pushing out. It's what the human species does. We're explorers. In order to do these missions, we need an incredibly powerful and incredibly capable rocket. And I'm excited to tell you that that rocket is the Space Launch System. You can see we have different configurations. The Block 1 crew, this first one there on the left, is what we flew on the Artemis 1 mission, and we'll fly on the next 2 missions. Beginning with Artemis 4, we're unveiling, debuting what we call the Block 1B vehicle. And the big difference is that we go from a single engine upper stage to a 4-engine upper stage. And this significantly enhances the amount of payload that we can send to the moon and other places in the solar system. We're also going to be having a Block 2 vehicle. Ultimately, after the 8th flight, we will run out of shuttle heritage hardware. And we do use shuttle heritage hardware, and I'll explain more about that later. So we run out of that hardware. We're working on what we call evolved boosters. More powerful boosters taking advantage of modern technologies, things like composites, that will further allow us to increase our mass to the moon and other locations. The great thing about SLS is you also see cargo configurations. We do have cargo versions of each what we call block, each variant. So we're not committed to sending only crew on this rocket. We can send crew and a co-manifested payload like a habitat module or something, but we can also do cargo-only missions. When we look at the volume on Block 1B and Block 2, we're looking at double the amount of volume on any currently heavy lift vehicle. Now, what that does is we look at James Webb, which is absolutely changing what we know about astronomy. It's incredible. Maybe it means that they don't have to have as many folding mechanisms, and you get to reduce that mission complexity when you get out there, which reduces your risk to the mission. So significant amount of volume, significant amount of mass increase as well. But really what I look at is the departure energy. You can see we can reduce transit times to the outer solar system by half or greater. And when you look at that chart down there in the corner and you go, well, 2.5 years to Jupiter versus 5.5, that's really not that much time, but it really is. You're reducing your risk to the mission. You're getting out of that transit environment. But I look at that scientist who has spent 30 years working to get a flagship NASA mission to conduct these incredible studies at Jupiter or wherever it is. And that 3 years to that scientist, that principal investigator, that could just mean the world to them. So we'll be able to get heavier stuff, bigger stuff, and get it there faster. The SLS vehicle that we flew on the first mission was the Block 1 crew. This rocket stands 322 feet tall, weighs 5.75 million pounds at liftoff, produces 8.8 million pounds, which is more than 1 million pounds more than that mighty Saturn V that took us to the moon for the first time. We have an upper stage that does 3 separate burns. 2 of these burns are one of them is a perigee raise maneuver. The other is the translunar injection. The third burn is a disposal burn to get it out of the way. It goes into a heliocentric disposal. On this flight, we carry the Orion spacecraft. We also carry 10 CubeSat secondary payloads, CubeSats that are about the size of a big shoebox, weighing about 25 to 30 pounds. And then if you didn't know, you look at the core stage and go, well, why is it orange? The foam will tan into UV, which I'm really jealous about because when I was down there in Florida supporting launch, I got out in the UV and I burned. So I need to get whatever that foam has in it so I can tan more. It's what we call the breakout chart. This is one of my favorites to talk. This is an opportunity to see the rocket and its components. And I always start there in the core stage. 212 feet long, weighs 188,000 pounds empty. If you're familiar with the Space Shuttle external tank, we maintain that same diameter, but this is a newly developed stage. The Space Shuttle external tank had a combined 535,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The liquid hydrogen tank on SLS alone has 537,000 gallons. On top of that, we add another 196,000 gallons of liquid oxygen. That 730,000 gallons of cryogenic propellant will be used by those 4 RS-25 engines, former Space Shuttle main engines, in about 8 minutes. And while it may sound like it's a thirsty engine, it's really not. In fact, this engine is so efficient. If your car engine were as efficient as an RS-25, your car engine would fit in the palm of your hand. It's an incredibly efficient, incredibly powerful, about 500,000 pounds of thrust each, and just truly a remarkable engine. Now, we produced about 2 million pounds with those 4 RS-25s from the core stage, but in order to launch Orion and the payloads that we need more power. So we have 2 solid rocket boosters. And if you're familiar with Space Shuttle, those probably look really familiar too, and they should. We're using heritage hardware. The big difference is that with the shuttle, we use 4 propellant segments. With SLS, we're using 5. So we increase our thrust on each booster from 3.3 million pounds to 3.6. Fun fact about the boosters, to give you an idea of the mass of propellant that they burn. Each booster burns about 11,000 pounds of propellant per second. They burn for about 2 minutes. And so the visual I always like to use is next time you're going to the store, look at 5 cars sitting there in the parking lot and imagine they probably weigh roughly 11,000 pounds. That's what each booster burns per second for about 2 minutes to provide 75% of the thrust to get us off the pad and accelerating towards space. Now, moving up the rocket, we have our launch vehicle stage adapter built by our friends at Teledyne Brown Engineering. I'm here in the SLS building out at Marshall Space Flight Center. That particular piece is built probably just about half a mile down the road from where I'm sitting. Our upper stage is the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. It's a lot of words. It's mouth soup to say that's our upper stage. It's a derivative of an upper stage that ULA has been flying on their Delta and Atlas rockets for many, many years. It's built by United Launch Alliance, just about 15 or 20 miles down the road from here in Decatur, Alabama. Excuse me. That RL-10 engine, incredibly powerful, about 25,000 pounds of thrust on it. That RL-10 engine has been part of the space program since the 1960s. I cannot even guess about how many missions we have flown that design. When we move to the Block 1B and the Block 2, we are maintaining that engine. We're just going to have 4 of them instead of 3, so we're really excited about that. We have the Orion stage adapter. That's a fairly small piece. That's where our CubeSat secondary payloads rose. And that's essentially what we would consider the top of the rocket. We then have a couple of payload adapters and those service modules that you saw fly off during that video before we get to our service module itself. That service module is built by Airbus under contract to the European Space Agency. I was fortunate enough to sit next to one of the people during launch countdowns who worked on that. She was terrific, and they were very excited to be a part of Artemis. We have the Orion Crew Module. Lockheed Martin builds that. That's where our astronauts will ride, 4 astronauts on board there. And then our launch abort system. That launch abort system, if anything happens to the rocket during the first about 3.5 minutes of flight, the launch abort system will pull Orion and the astronauts safely off of the vehicle and return them. Now, we don't ever intend to use it, but it is there as an emergency tool. You can see the core stage here. We did a test on it. We did a number of testing at Stennis Space Center, which is where that photo on the left is from. And then we did launch it on November 16th. Those RS-25s, you'll be seeing them ignite here momentarily. We ignite them about 6.5 seconds before launch. Their computers are running dozens and dozens of checks to make sure that they're operating before we ignite those boosters. And we are beginning with Artemis 5. We'll have new manufactured engines. So keep an eye out on our social media and our website, because we are testing the engines at Stennis Space Center. In fact, we just had the first one, I believe, yesterday or Wednesday. And we always live stream those engines. They're always cool to test, or always cool to watch, rather. Arc solid rocket boosters, they are absolute beasts. You can see our partners at Northrop Grumman who build them. They strap them down. We test them horizontally and blast them into a hillside. It will turn those rocks and that sand on that hillside into glass. We've got some more testing coming up on these boosters as we continue to learn and evolve for future missions. And then our interim cryogenic propulsion stage. This stage is so incredibly important. It gives Orion the final shove that it needs to go out to the moon, and it did it incredibly well. Artemis 1 mission objectives. Why did we fly this mission and why weren't astronauts on there? Number one goal, test the heat shield. Before we commit astronauts to coming back through the atmosphere, slowing down from almost 25,000 miles an hour, we need to make sure the heat shield is going to perform like we need it to protect them, and that the Orion structure will provide the safety we need it to. You can see re-entry will get nearly 5,000 degrees, half as hot as the surface of the sun. But we also need to test all of SLS's systems. The reality of it is that first-time rockets have a 50-50 shot of whether they'll succeed or not. That's just how it is. It's an incredibly dynamic and incredibly challenging event when you're trying to cheat gravity. Gravity doesn't like it. So we needed to test all of SLS's systems. And I can tell you from working with the engineers and following this rocket for many years, we've tested every nut and bolt you can. But ultimately, you get to a point where the way you get the rest of the data is by flying. We needed to test all of Orion's systems in that deep space environment. Once you get beyond the Van Allen radiation belts, once you get out by the moon, the environment's incredibly different and challenging. So we need to make sure that we can communicate with the spacecraft and that it performs like we expect it to. We needed to know how Orion flew in space. We also need to make sure that we feel good with our recovery systems and let our teams practice recovering a flight-flown vehicle. Our partners with the Navy are absolutely terrific, and we were able to successfully recover it, as you'll hear later. And then we need to test all of the ground processing and launch facilities. Heard me say we have to listen to the hardware, and we learned a significant amount as we were tanking 730,000 gallons of cryogenic propellants. And so learned a terrific amount. Our partners at Ground Systems did an awesome job. And so this is a map of what the launch looked like. We launched out of Kennedy Space Center. We went into an Earth orbit. We raised we did what we call a perigee, raise maneuver, to raise the closest point in Earth's orbit. We checked out all of the systems, and then we committed to translunar injection burn to go out to the moon. We went into what we call a distant retrograde orbit. This orbit is highly elliptical. It's about a 12-day orbital period. We got as close as about 81 miles to the surface of the moon and some nearly 40,000 miles away. During this mission, Orion went further than any spacecraft designed for human had ever gone before. They got over 268,000 miles away from the Earth on this mission. Did a couple burns, and we came home and splashed down off the coast of Baja, California, December 11th, about a 25-and-a-half-day mission. It was great. I tell you about the rocket, how beautiful I think it is, how much I love it. How did it actually do? Well, we are still doing data analysis, and we will be doing data analysis for many months still. But all preliminary data indicates that SLS did its job incredibly well, and that we are ready to support crew on Artemis 2. The boosters perform flawlessly. They do provide 75% of thrust during the first 2 minutes of flight. Separation went extremely well. That core stage inserted Orion and the ICPS into an initial orbit just about 3 miles off the perfect bullseye. Now that orbit that we were putting it into had a furthest point from Earth of over 900 miles. So you can see off perfect bullseye by less than 3 miles. As the chief engineer firmly told me one morning not too long ago, while the altitude is great, what really is important is orbital insertion velocity. Our orbital insertion velocity was over 25,000 feet per second, and we were off by 6.5 feet. So you can see there, less than 3/100ths of a percent. During that translunar injection burn, the RL-10 engine, which had been flying as part of the space program since the 1960s, set a record duration burn of 18 minutes. One of our leaders said this: "We hit a mosquito from 500,000 miles away." Rockets don't fly this well, and they definitely don't fly this well on the first shot. And we are extremely grateful that they did, but we're always looking to improve, and so we are continuing our data analysis. Some pictures from launch. The photos were absolutely incredible. And this first picture on the left, whenever I see this one thought comes to mind, and it's a memory that I had when we launched. It's that all of a sudden it got dark. When we launched, SLS climbed off the pad and made its way into space incredibly quickly. I'd seen a space shuttle launch when I was a kid at night, and fortunate enough to see some SpaceX launches at night too. And I just remember being struck with, oh my gosh, it got dark a lot quicker than I expected it to. Something really important to remember: rockets don't launch rockets. People launch rockets. And you can see here some of the faces that made this mission happen. We had people at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where we launched from, at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, where the mission was managed from. Just about a mile and a half away from me, where I'm sitting at Marshall Space Flight Center, our SLS engineering support room, and at contractor and partner sites all around the country and really all around the world that enabled this mission to happen. These people trained tirelessly. They threw their hearts and their souls into it. Their families sacrificed, all so that humanity can return to the moon. And so remember, rockets don't launch rockets. It's the people that do it. SLS launched, everything went well. How did the Orion spacecraft do? Orion did incredibly well, additionally. In fact, it was so smooth that we actually added 19 mission objectives during the mission. That's unheard of as far as I know. That all-important re-entry system worked incredibly well, slowing Orion down from 25,000 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour in a matter of 20 minutes. That heat shield got hot. In fact, I love this photo on the left because you can actually see it looks like some of the vapor coming off as it's still cooling down during as it's under parachute. The in-space systems performed extremely well. The solar arrays, there are 4 of them, responsible for the photos that you'll see here on the next slides. They generated more power than we were expecting, and Orion used less power than we were expecting. So great on both ends. The propellant usage of the spacecraft was also less. At one point, they had 200 pounds of margin. Toward the end of the mission, there was at least 100 pounds of margin. I don't know what it was when we finally wrapped up. But the spacecraft just flew terrific. It splashed down on December 11th. That was a Sunday, right in the middle of the day. The reentry corridor was actually set up during a burn on the far side of the moon some 6 days prior. And we used the skip reentry profile. If you remember the days of the Apollo and Mercury and Gemini, we would have our Navy fleet spread out over hundreds of miles because we knew generally where they were coming down. But, there was always some variability there. Well, this new reentry profile, skip reentry profile, does a couple of really cool things. And one of those things is it allows us to do a very precise landing. And if you're not familiar with it, I nerd out about it because I think it's incredibly cool. The best way to visualize it is skipping a rock across a lake. We bring Orion in across the top of the atmosphere at a very shallow angle. We dissipate heat, we dissipate speed, and we dissipate some energy. Orion then has a little bit of lift, and then it begins its final descent. And so what this does for us, in addition to making our reentry point very accurate and very precise, it breaks that reentry temperature and G-load event into 2 smaller events. This is safer and more comfortable for both the spacecraft and the astronauts, and it worked extremely well by all accounts. Now, we are still analyzing data, but everything looks good so far. Some of the pictures were absolutely incredible. This camera was up higher up on Orion. This is just after the Orion separated from the ICPS from the upper stage of the rocket. You can see the rocket there in the background, and you can see one of Orion's solar arrays there in the bottom right. This photo still blows my mind. We're looking at both the Earth and the Moon in this photograph. And if memory serves, this is one of the photos that was taken as we were going out to the furthest point from Earth. These solar arrays do have cameras on board, which is why we're able to get the Orion selfies like we are. And then inside, we had a lot of important tech demonstration missions inside Orion itself. You can see there in the front left seat is Commander Moonikin Campos, named after Arturo Campos, who helped save the Apollo 13 mission. This mannequin was outfitted with all kinds of sensors so we can understand what the ride will be like for our astronauts as they fly on Orion. Also not in this picture were two mannequin torsos, female mannequin torsos, one wearing a radiation vest and one not. So we can really understand what that radiation environment is like for the female body. We also had the Callisto tech demonstration. Some of y'all may be Alexa members. This is, or Alexa users. This is kind of Alexa for space. My favorite, and I'll point it out, you can see him down there in the tunnel. We flew Snoopy. He was our zero-G indicator, continuing a great partnership NASA has had with the with the Schultz family and the Peanuts Foundation and organization. We're incredibly excited to fly Snoopy, and he is safely back in the hands with the Schultz family. And then there's this photo. I was watching the video live when this scene came on. Excuse me. We had just finished the return burn to set up that reentry corridor. And you can see the sun, you kind of see some sun glare, and that red dot is not Mars. That's just an artifact from the camera. When we're coming back around the moon, and this photo gets taken, and that crescent way out in the distance is us. That's home. So this image to me is always one of the most, I hope will become one of the most iconic images of the space program. It truly has impacted me, and I can't wait to see when we have astronauts that get this view. And it will happen soon. Artemis 2, our first astronauts to travel out to the moon since the Apollo 17 mission in December of 1972. 3 Americans, 1 Canadian will launch on the Orion spacecraft for a lunar flyby. Their job is to check out Orion. So you can see we'll have a fully operational abort system just to make sure that if anything goes wrong, we'll get our crew off of there. We have additional avionics on the upper stage on the ICPS to communicate with Orion. Orion will have a full life support system. The astronauts will be able to test that out. And then that third bullet is one that as a wannabe race car driver and someone who likes to go fly periodically, I'm excited about and slightly envious about. You see, after Orion separates from the upper stage from ICPS, they're actually going to turn the spacecraft around. And they're going to fly a choreographed pattern around that upper stage to test out Orion. They're going to be the first astronauts to be able to fly and test fly Orion in space, which I'm sure the test pilots are just drooling over who will get to do it. We haven't named the crew yet. I don't know. I have my guesses, but they are strictly guesses. We expect to be getting an announcement about the Artemis 2 crew later this spring. And then Artemis 3, the first woman, the first person of color, starting our lunar expeditions, boots back on the moon, this time to stay. We'll conduct a variety of moonwalks, collect samples, some of which will be returned. We will have upmass, not challenges, but limitations, just like they did during Apollo. So we will bring some samples home, characterize the environment, deploy some instruments so that even after this crew does return home, we can continue collecting data. Big thing about Artemis 3, the SpaceX Starship, their human lander system will be our lander, and so the astronauts will have the incredibly important task of testing it and landing it on the moon and checking out all of its systems and how it performs. And then we'll capture real-time human response we need to check out the spacesuits. How do they do? Our Apollo astronauts learned a lot, and they learned how to operate in the spacesuit, especially once they got on the moon. How does this new generation of spacesuit, how does it perform? We are not a one and done rocket, I can assure you that. While Artemis 1 is complete and we have flown that mission, we are making a lot of progress to Artemis 2. In fact, our core stage is just about done. We'll be mating the engine section, that white portion down at the bottom, here in just the next few weeks. And then we'll be installing the RS-25 engines. We are also working on the forward and aft parts of our solid rocket boosters, but we already have a lot done. Our booster propellant segments are cast, our RS-25 engines are ready to go. The launch vehicle stage adapter, the Orion stage adapter, and the ICPS are pretty much done. Artemis 3, our return to the surface of the moon, making a lot of progress on the core stage and our adapters in our upper stage. Our booster propellant segments are already cast. Artemis 4, the first flight of the Block 1B, lots being named right now. And then Artemis 5, down there way at the bottom, new engines. After Artemis 5, we are out of shuttle heritage engines, and so we have to manufacture new ones. And we have started that process. We are manufacturing Aerojet Rocketdyne. They're doing a terrific job, and we're able to take advantage of modern technologies such as additive manufacturing, and we're producing these quicker and cheaper than before. So Artemis 5 will debut those new engines. Once again, that engine test series, certification test series is going on. We've got a couple dozen tests throughout the calendar year. And this is what it actually looks like, the pieces and parts as they're coming together. So we have our core stage, that 212-foot long, mostly done. There in the center, you're looking at the top of the ICPS, looking down toward it. The engines would be on the back side of this as we're looking at it. Continuing clockwise, you can see how we build the tanks themselves. We build them in barrel sections and then have a dome on either end. We are continuing to test hot fire our solid rocket boosters for Artemis 3 and beyond. Those advanced boosters that I mentioned with the Block 2, we're taking advantage of composites. We'll be able to eliminate the steel casing, which lightens those boosters. We're working on some of those composite casings now. The interstage is part of the Block 1B and Block 2. We're working on some weld confidence panels right now as we develop that variant. And this slide is something that is one that I think is very important, because I want you all to know something. This rocket is not just my rocket, it's your rocket. It is as much your rocket as it is the chief engineers, as it is the program manager for SLS. This is a national capability. SLS is the only rocket capable of sending Orion out to the deep space environment. The things we can do with SLS and the payloads, we do them on a single launch. It's an incredibly capable rocket. And Orion is the only spacecraft capable of sustaining crew in that deep space environment, maintaining that emergency abort capability, and safely returning our crew from lunar return velocities. Orion SLS, combined with our partners at the Exploration Ground Systems, are supported by 3,800 suppliers, over 60,000 workers in every single U.S. state. This is truly a national capability, and it's one that we all hope you are proud of. We are certainly honored to be the ones who are here making it happen and helping make it happen. This video doesn't have any audio. You can see the RS-25s come into life there. You can see the boosters just explode to life, and we begin climbing off the pad. 1:47 in the morning. It could have been 3 o'clock in the afternoon if you had told us the way this rocket truly lit up the night sky. You can see fading in the tower, or in the background, one of the lightning protection systems. We go into that roll maneuver, and if you've never been down to Kennedy, the launch pad really is that close to the beach. And one of the ways I know this is due to Ms. Dear Anastasia. During the countdown for the first launch attempt in August, we were in our Loops monitoring room watching everything, and I have Facebook up just to monitor things. And I get a message from her with the most incredible pictures of the rocket from the ocean. Now, I had no idea you could do that. I had no idea there were such boat tours that allowed you to go do that. I was incredibly jealous, and I will be taking one of those boat tours before Artemis 2. I can guarantee you that. We go to the moon and we explore space with peace and hope for all humanity. Technology's changed the world. NASA technology and technology that's coming out of our space exploration is vital to our everyday lives. Everything that makes life more enjoyable to life that truly makes things that make life possible. We came in peace, we return in peace, and we do it for all humanity. And with that, I thank you for allowing me to have a few minutes of your time. I thank you for being a part of the Artemis generation. You are truly part of the space program, and we thank you for that. And with that, I look forward to answering any questions. If you're not following Artemis on social media, please continue to. Also follow SLS and check out all the cool stuff we get to do. Thanks again for allowing me to have some time, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Will. Let's see if we have any questions from the room. Do you have any questions in here? We have any on the chat. Over here.
I was wondering, how does the skip landing actually enable a more accurate splashdown?
So I'm not the expert on this by any stretch, but when we catch, my understanding is that as we catch that lift after the first entry interface, using the RCS thrusters, we're able to that corridor, that ellipse that we use is much more certain. At that, we don't have as much variability of that, and that is really about the extent of my knowledge.
Hey, Will, we got another question.
Excellent.
He's asking about the pesky hydrogen leak, and he's a pesky person. So are any enhancements being implemented to prevent that pesky hydrogen leak that plagued the mission?
Yeah, so we're always, I don't know of anything specific. I can tell you that the teams are meeting regularly, looking at all of the lessons learned. Absolutely hydrogen, and that was a challenge. And hydrogen, as he aptly described, is pesky. Terrific molecule and compound from an energy standpoint, but it can be challenging to work with. So the short answer is that everything's being looked at, and any improvements that they can make, I assure you they will. And we learned before the last launch attempt, or before ultimately launch, we did that tanking test, and we got to a point where it became, let's study, let's keep an eye on everything, and through that we learned. So we're always in a mode of learning as much as we can. And so yes, I would imagine if there's anything that we can do to improve that, whether it's procedures or hardware interface changes, that it's without a doubt being looked at.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question on Facebook. How many astronauts will be traveling on Artemis 2?
Artemis 2 will have 4 astronauts. We will have 3 Americans and 1 Canadian.
All right. What's the current best estimate on when humans will go to Mars?
Humans to go to Mars, my understanding is probably the 2030s. I haven't looked at the manifest lately, but that's the latest I recall hearing. And that's for NASA. And one thing to note about NASA is that when we go to Mars, I talk about the challenges of getting there. It's also getting back, because we will bring our astronauts home, as is the way we operate our missions. Not throwing shade on anybody, just for that clarification, we will be sending them to Mars and bringing them home. And I can't wait, because they will be celebrities who I will be dying to meet.
Are there any technical limitations on reducing the transit time to the moon and beyond eventually?
Yeah, so chemical propulsion has a limit. And one of the things that we're looking at, might have heard NASA has a partnership with DARPA to look at nuclear propulsion. nuclear propulsion enables us to reduce that transit time. I'm not familiar with the technical hows and whys it works, but nuclear propulsion stands to significantly reduce that transit time. I think it'll be a really important technology for us to have as in-space propulsion to get us to Mars and back and into other locations in the solar system.
So this is Anne Murphy. I have a question. Has there been any thought to, I know that going to Mars or even going to the moon, you still have to contend with radiation. Has Artemis, have they thought about that, got that done, at least, at least for the minimum, since we're just going to the moon, thought about the radiation issue?
Yeah, absolutely. Radiation is one of the biggest concerns that we have, because once you get away from those Van Allen radiation belts or outside of them, it's the radiation environment is just drastically different. So one of the things that we did do on Orion, and I'll come back to this internal shot, is we had two mannequin torsos. DLR, the German space agency, flew two mannequin torsos. And what they did is one of them was wearing a radiation protection device and one of them was not. And they were both outfitted with sensors. And so the goal is to understand how much radiation the astronauts will get during a mission, and how do we counteract that. Looking at missions to Mars, whether it's to the surface or just in transit time, there's a lot of work going on. Can we use packaging to insulate? The International Space Station has safe areas that if there's a solar flare coming that will impact the space station, the astronauts have a safe place to go. So we'll certainly have things like that so that we can protect it. One of the interesting things, thinking about living and working off of the land, can we use the regolith, essentially the planetary soil on the moon and Mars as radiation shielding for the habitats once we're there? I know there have been studies that looked at, are there caves or lava tubes on the moon and Mars that we can put our habitats in to protect our astronauts from the radiation? So yes, absolutely, it's a huge priority for us.
We've had a question in the chat. I heard contracts, there's an R in there, were already awarded for building bases on the moon. Do you have information on this, and how may it be automated?
I do not have information on it. I know we are working on modules for the Gateway, which is our outpost that will stay in our lunar orbit that we're going to be using. I'm not aware of contracts for lunar base. That doesn't mean they're not there. But we are doing research. In fact, there's been research going on here at Marshall Space Flight Center of how can you 3D print using lunar regolith, and we have simulants. So we've been to the moon, a small part of the moon, so we have an idea of kind of what that material might be like, so we can make simulants of that and begin testing. Can we 3D print concrete on the moon for those habitats?
And the question's been asked, could storing water around the perimeter of the spacecraft protect against radiation?
Yeah, as far as I know, from a technical standpoint, I think it can. I'm certainly not an expert, but I believe water is an insulator. It's just a matter of, what do you have and how best can you use it?
Are there any parts of the SLS that are reusable from one launch to the next?
Yeah, so SLS is not a reusable vehicle. We looked at the studies very significantly, and with the flight rate that we were given to us by our key stakeholders, by Congress, the cost to refurbish an SLS is very expensive. When you look at reusability, you're paying penalties in two ways. You're paying a cost penalty to do it, and you're paying a significant mass penalty to do it. So for instance, the parachutes on the solid rocket boosters, just the parachutes alone during the space shuttle, each set of those parachutes weighed 1,000 pounds. By eliminating those, that's 2,000 more pounds that we can send to translunar injection to the moon. So unfortunately, with the flight rate that we've been given and doing all the analysis, it's cheaper to build new ones than it is to recover and refurbish.
Okay, thank you, Will. Do we have any more questions in the room? I don't think so. We don't have any more on chat. Oh, one just popped in. How does Gateway compare in size to the current ISS configuration? Will Gateway be modular past the first iteration?
So I would have to look that up. I'm not a Gateway expert, but Gateway in its early form will be, I would say, noticeably smaller than the International Space Station. We are going to be launching it in modules, so SOS will not be the only rocket launching pieces of the Gateway. And it's a terrific international collaboration. But my understanding is that it will be smaller, at least for now. I believe the goal and the hope would certainly be that we can add modules onto it, and that there's interest from various partners to do that as we continue to build that permanent sustainable presence on and around the moon.
All right, I don't see any more questions in chat. Do we have any more questions in the room? Okay. Looks like we have one more. Just a second.
There's something interesting and almost funny. If the U.S. was having trouble meeting its financial debt, wonder how they're able to afford wanting to go to Mars. But then again, if it's for science, I guess it's every bit worth it. That's all my 2 cents I have.
Well, and I will tell you that when it comes to the budgets, we are NASA. We we belong to you all is what I'm trying to get out. And we certainly pay a lot of attention to make sure that we're using your money in it the best way possible. When you look at the overall federal budget, though, you look at the tiny slice that NASA gets. It's very small. And while launching rockets and doing great feats of exploration with our partners across the globe, while it may look expensive, and it certainly is, when you look at what our piece of the pie is from the government, it's quite small. And then we have all the technology benefits that come back. And so in my past life, supporting the Office of the Chief Technologist, spinoffs were my world. And looking at the technologies from the earliest days to now that we use everyday lives, or that save lives all around the world. The space program certainly has a tremendous financial impact in a variety of ways to our country.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Will. I don't think we have any other questions in the room or in chat or on Facebook. So thank you so much. Let's give Will a round of applause.
Well, y'all, it was truly my pleasure, and y'all have fun up there. I hope you have some great skies to explore and look at the cosmos. I know I'll be having my telescope, and my beautiful fiance will get her telescope out here soon and go do some stargazing of our own. So y'all have fun, and thanks again for having me, and thanks for being a part of the Artemis generation.
Thank you, Will. Really appreciate it.